president of the Davis Alt Protein Project Club here at UC Davis. I'm also a second-year food science PhD student researching cultivated meat with Professor Block, who is joining our panel today. Joining me as moderators are some other club officers, including Mariah Meyer, Sophie Pinton, and Anne Tran. So first, a little about our club. We're a group of interdisciplinary undergrad and grad students who are interested in promoting and learning more about alternative protein foods. We're also supported by a nonprofit organization called the Good Food Institute. And our definition of alt protein is plant-based or cell-cultured foods or ingredients that are intended to mimic and replace conventional animal-derived protein foods. For the sake of today's discussion, though, our official club position is that expansion of traditional animal agriculture is not really the best long-term option for society, given various sustainability, public health, and ethical concerns. So with that said, we're excited to welcome our 5 UC Davis panelists today for a discussion and probably some debate about their expertise and viewpoints as they relate to alt protein. I also want to point out that there are several other professors on campus who are interested in this field, but many of them were not able to join us today, unfortunately. But luckily, we are joined by Dr. David Block from Viticulture and Enology and Chemical Engineering, Dr. Alison van Eenennaam from Animal Science, Dr. Ermias Kebreab, also from Animal Science, Dr. Chris Hopwood from Psychology, and Marie Barone, a senior dietitian at UC Davis Medical Center. And so with that, I would like to let the panelists give a short 3 or 4 minute of their background and expertise as they may relate to alt protein. We'll then pose some prepared questions for the panelists, and then we'll take audience questions that are submitted through the chat on Zoom. And so first, we'll start with Dr. Block. So thank you for joining us today.
Great. Well, thanks, Ted. Thanks for the introduction. Just say a few words about my background and what we're working on and what we're interested in this area. My background's in chemical engineering. After getting my PhD, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 5 years, doing fermentation process development and also helping to build manufacturing facilities that included facilities growing mammalian cells and making pharmaceuticals out of them. So it's related, not very different, could probably a very different process from, let's say, cultivated meat, but at least very related. Joining UC Davis, the main areas that I've been working on at Davis have been in fermentation, process development, and especially fermentation optimization, coming up with methods that allow you to optimize whatever kind of fermentation you're working on. And for chemical engineers, fermentation not only means an anaerobic fermentation like a wine fermentation, but really anytime you're growing cells to make a useful product. And so that's what we've been focusing on. A lot of the work I did going back maybe 10 years or so was if you wanted to start with a process where you didn't know anything about it and you wanted to optimize it in the shortest possible time or the fewest experiments, which is what you would like to do if you were in industry, how do you do that? And so we started developing experimental optimization methods that proved to be quite a lot more efficient than what the best kind of methods that were out there at the time, which were things like statistically designed experiments or design of experiments methods. We showed that we could, for bacteria, we could actually develop media, which is one of the key things for process optimization, develop media that was a better media, supported more growth in half the experiments of using traditional methods. So we did quite a bit of work on that and published in that area, mostly related to microbial fermentations. And then starting about 2 years ago, we started applying some of those methods and further developing those methods for cultivated meat. Cultivated meat is a very interesting topic right now. It's got a huge amount of growth, at least in the number of companies in this area. None of them have a product on the market. One of the key hurdles among many hurdles in getting a product to market is that the media that they use, the nutrients that they use to grow cells, are basically too expensive, and they're not optimized for growth of cultivated meat lines. They're optimized for growth of mammalian cells producing pharmaceuticals. And so I started working in this area about 2 years ago. Ted is one of my students. I also have a student in chemical engineering who's working more on the optimization methods. It's a complex problem. Many of the media have 50 or 60 ingredients, and there's not much experience working with the cell lines, at least for the production of meat, not only for the growth of these cell lines, but also getting them to not differentiate when you don't want them to differentiate, and actually differentiating into muscle, fat, fibroblast cells when you do want them to differentiate. All of those are difficult problems, and so in my lab we're working on trying to help overcome those technical hurdles.
Great, thank you, Dr. Black. Up next is Alison doing Eenennaam.
Hello.
Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, by the way.
Yeah, you can hear me okay? Yep. Okay, so yeah, thanks for the invitation. So my name's Alison van Eenennaam. You actually did a pretty good job there. And I am working in genetics and breeding of animals, and with a particular focus on cattle. And I've been at the university about 20 years. I actually started off before I joined the university at Kebreab, during the time when they released their genetically engineered flavor saver tomato. And so that was a really exciting time to be involved in biotech. And it was kind of I guess a little bit of an interesting segue into my position, because basically the misinformation and the brouhaha around GMOs has pretty much eliminated the ability to use that technology in animal breeding programs. And so, you know, we've got 18 million farmers growing GM crops and basically nothing approved except for the fish, which you can't even buy in America. And so I've been quite involved in public communication around GMOs because I really wanted the ability to use the technology, and particularly CRISPR editing now, in animal livestock systems. So I guess my theoretical background is molecular biology, and I actually have my own genetic molecular lab, and we do cell culture with cells, and so I know what fickle little creatures they are, and so I think there's a lot of technical issues there that will need to be resolved. But I guess my interest is, you know, I see the importance that breeding has had on the overall environmental footprint of food production. Ermias will probably get into that a little bit more. And given my background of misinformation around the GMO debate, I'm a little bit trepidatious at some of the arguments that I see for this technology. And I don't want a dichotomous framing of you either eat steaks or cultured beef and there's no in between. I think the demand for protein is big and there's room for both of us. And I think it's really important for our land-grant university to be supportive of science and not use misinformation to rationalize the research we do. And perhaps no greater time has science literacy been under attack than right now. And so I guess my interest is that. I also, and I see that Pablo Ross isn't actually on this program, but I will just speak for my colleague who's a geneticist and was involved in the development of embryonic stem cells from cattle. And that's been kind of the holy grail that we've been working on for many years for a variety of genetic improvement purposes. But that particular immortal cell line that you can differentiate down different pathways, I think has potential interest to this particular field as well. And so I'll put in a plug for Dr. Pablo Ross as I finish up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, up next is Dr. Kebreab.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me well. All right. So thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Ermias Kebreab, and I'm originally from Eritrea, which is a relatively small country in the east coast of Africa. And my family owned some cattle. So I've had intimate sort of exposure to cattle raising, and one of the drivers of why I wanted to get into this field is actually because we didn't have enough animal source food, particularly milk, for everybody, and that got me thinking, oh, this is a very nutritious product, but we can't actually have enough of it, and we can see a lot of suffering happening because of lack of nutrition, particularly animal source food. And so I got into biology and then interested in agriculture and ended up sort of working in this field. And what I'm working on right now, it's two kind of aspects. And one is on nutritional requirement of particularly dairy cattle, but also beef and other livestock as well. And the reason is that by trying to get the adequate nutrition, the right amount of nutrition, you can actually reduce the environmental footprint of cattle. So we're working to make sure that we are adequately providing the nutrients that the animals need. And for a lot of places in developing countries or in low-income countries, the issue is the lack of productivity of animals. So you have a lot of animals that are not producing as much, so that the environmental footprint is much bigger. While here, we have reduced the number of animals we used to have 40, 50 years ago, and now we have a smaller amount of animals, but more productivity. That way, the environmental footprint is lower. The other part of my work is more directly related to reducing the environmental impact directly by, well, one of the things that animals get a bad rap is greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane emissions. And so we are targeting enteric methane emissions in particular to try to reduce it so that livestock can actually become a carbon neutral activity. Some of you might not believe that this is possible to get to that, but that's actually the goal in the next 10 years or so, to get to a carbon neutral livestock production. And in my lab, we're doing different type of feed additives to try to achieve this, to try to reduce methane emissions. The latest work that we're doing using seaweed, we are able to reduce enteric methane emissions by up to 80%. So this is quite huge reduction in emissions, and you don't have to add too much of that as well. And there are others that are not yet on the market, but it will be in the market very soon. And you will get reductions 30–40% in enteric methane emissions, and in combination of the feed additives, you can actually drive it quite low. So if you are able to do that, there's even a paper that came out using seaweed, the same seaweed that we are using right now in Australia, that reduces emissions by 98%. So if you are able to do that, and coupled with the potential for carbon sequestration, then livestock production can actually become carbon neutral, or even take out carbon from the atmosphere. And depending how you account for methane, you actually would be able to drive climate cooling around the globe. So that's what I've been working on to try to make livestock production more sustainable.
Okay, thank you so much. Next is Dr. Chris Hopwood.
Thanks for inviting me. My background's pretty different than the colleagues that I've heard so far. It's really interesting to hear about their research. I'm a psychologist trained in clinical psychology, and in particular in psychological assessment. So my background has to do with trying to develop measurement tools to figure out how and why people are different from one another, and then to use those tools to track the sources of those differences and the consequences of differences. And early in my career, I applied that to problems like how to diagnose mental disorders, or how to characterize personality, or how to figure out how much personality changes and why it changes. In the last few years, I've started becoming more interested in the question of why people make different dietary choices, and in particular, why they choose to be vegetarian or not be vegetarian, with that term being broad to include vegans, reducitarians, etc. I've got 3 lines of research currently with my collaborator, Dr. Viticulture, who's also in the psychology department at Davis. The first one has to do with motivations to be vegetarian. Most of the research in this area has involved the different psychological differences between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, such as gender or political orientation or personality traits like openness to experience. We were interested in the question, among vegetarians or non-vegetarians, what are the different motivational profiles that people might have? The 3 main motives, that non-religious motives, at least in the West, for being vegetarians are health, the environment, and animal rights. And so we generated a measure of these motives and then tried to use that measure to generate psychological profiles of the types of people that would be more sympathetic to different kinds of motives. We found that health was the most commonly reported motives among non-vegetarians by a fairly wide margin, but that animal rights, and particularly the environment to a somewhat lesser extent, was a more compelling motive in terms of sustaining vegetarian behavior and that sort of thing. And so this creates a kind of interesting paradox for advocates in terms of how to convince non-vegetarians to consider eating alternative proteins or vegetarian food, etc. We're currently planning a field study to see whether those motivations predict actual dietary choices, and we're applying for funding for that study right now. The second line has to do with the opposite question: what are the different motivations that people have to eat animals and animal products? In that work, we and others have found that there's generally speaking 4 different kinds of motivations. The first is that people think that it's more natural to eat animals and animal products than otherwise. The people who have this belief tend to be sort of politically libertarian, like to be in nature, like hunting and that sort of thing. Second motivation that people cite is that it's necessary for health or for effective functioning. People of that profile tend to be sort of politically traditional and conservative, to like more authoritarian sort of approaches to governance, more traditional gender roles and that kind of thing. Third is that it's normal to eat meat. Everybody does it, so everyone should do it. This was the least healthy of the profiles. People who give this as their main motivation tend to have sort of immature personality traits, in particular a tendency to be antagonistic and externalizing. And the final is that meat and animal products taste good, so it's nice. And people with this profile tend to be relatively hedonistic and pleasure-oriented. So these 2 lines of work together help us understand a little bit about the social cognitive aspects of why people make dietary choices, and we're hoping that they'll lead to a more mechanistic understanding of how those choices play out in daily life. There's also some applied value for advocacy groups seeking to target their campaigns to different people based on their individual or personalized motivational profiles. The third line is to try to track changes in a variety of different sustainable related behaviors, including alternative proteins and vegetarian diet, and how that tracks with changes in personality over time. So we know that personality changes normatively, but we also know that personality in adults, some people change more than others in terms of their personality traits. And there's a fairly large literature on how personality and sustainable behavior correlate cross-sectionally, but so far no one's examined this in large representative studies longitudinally. So we've got a couple of projects in New Zealand, Germany, and the Netherlands trying to track correlations between vegetarian eating and other sustainability-related behaviors and personality change. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. So last but not least is Marie Barone.
Thank you. I'm Marie Barone, and I'm a registered dietitian here at UC Davis Health. And my background has been in our preventive cardiology program, where we provide resources for a mostly whole food, plant-based meal plan for people who have had cardiac issues or trying to prevent future cardiac issues. Currently, I work here in our health management and education department as a certified diabetes care and education specialist as well. And so my focus is mainly on the nutritional aspects of these meat alternatives and the impact that they may have compared to consuming more traditional meat products.
Okay, thank you. So now we will begin with some prepared questions. So I think Sophie can start us off asking the first question.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I am the student who has been emailing you all, so thank you for responding to me and dealing with all of the questions that I've been asking. The first question, and for all of these, we are going to direct it to one person, but we would definitely like others to chime in with their perspectives. But the first question is directed towards Dr. Van Eenennaam about what sorts of biotechnology from the livestock industry do you think could be used to improve cell agriculture? So your work with animal breeding, with genome editing or cell editing, with genome screening, which of those do you think can be applied to improving cell agriculture and making it feasible?
So I already mentioned the embryonic stem cells, which that's one of the holdups, is to get cells that are immortal and that can differentiate into different cell types. So I think that's probably a pretty obvious one. I mean, one of the other things you likely need to get immortality is some type of I don't want to use the term genetic engineering, but genetic modification, and to basically maybe just even knock out a couple of genes that will enable that kind of immortality. And, you know, there you're going to run into the same drama that I mentioned at the beginning of my introduction, and that is, you know, are you going to choose to go the high road and stick for science and say we're using, I don't know, editing because that's the most efficient way to get it done? Or are you going to go kind of the scaremongering, like, oh, we can't have any GMO product, because then you've tied your hands behind your back. And so I hope that we're going to have, you know, don't take that path, because basically I look at the foregone opportunities that we could have done with editing and genetic engineering in terms of things like disease resistance, maybe even, you know, African swine fever pigs that didn't get sick, but we haven't been able to use it because of that. And so I think there's some obvious genetic molecular approaches that you would probably need to, if we're speaking specifically in vitro meat at this stage, to basically make the cell lines suitable to the growth. I mean, I'm not going to make light of the fact that I think there's some incredible challenges in terms of getting to scale. And I think it's probably a good idea to look at the kind of scale we're talking about, because, you know, some of the venture capital projections I've seen of, like, I don't know, 40% of meat will be traditional animal and 60% will be alternatives, and I think 25% is going to be cell cultured in 20 years. That's a little over 1 trillion burgers a year. So, you know, those numbers, I think when you look at that, it's like, do we really have to replace everything, or does it make sense to try to make it, you know, that they work together rather than being antagonistic towards each other?
Great, thank you so
Sophia,
much.
If I can add something to that.
Yes.
I agree with what Alison said. I do see, let's say, cultivated meat as more of a supplement to traditional agriculture, because there is a growing need for protein. And at this point, I would agree with Alison. I don't think there's enough information out there to know whether it's going to be technically feasible or not to have this industry. Obviously, there are a lot of companies. None of them have a product on the market, and I think the technical hurdles are substantial. I will point out, though, for something like Impossible Burgers, it's very interesting that heme that they put into that Impossible Burger that's they feel is critical to the taste is actually a GMO. It's produced in yeast and then added to the product. And so it's interesting to think about what's the difference between having a yeast produce heme and sticking that in your plant-based burger versus a cultivated meat burger that has genetic modification. And so it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition there.
All right.
Okay.
Do we have time for one more question, or should we go to the next panelist?
I think we can move to the next question. This is for Dr. Block. So I would say you're one of the more preeminent figures in the whole alt protein research space on campus as of now. So could you describe a little bit about your knowledge of the current state of interdisciplinary alt protein research here at UC Davis?
Sure, I think all of my colleagues will agree that to call someone preeminent and important in a field on campus when they've only been working in a field for a year and a half, when the field is only a couple of years old, is maybe going a little bit far, but there aren't that many people who are actively working in this area on campus. So I'm working with, collaborating with Keith Barr in the College of Biological Sciences. We have 2 students working on this and now funding for a 3rd student. And at this point, that's the bulk of the active research. There is a little bit of research going on in terms of looking at the techno-economic analysis and life cycle analysis, understanding whether it's going to be economically feasible and sustainable to do this. But there isn't a lot. Now, having said that, not having a lot in a small field is still large compared to generally what's going on other campuses. In the fall, in October, there were about 30 people who met on campus, faculty members, other researchers, staff members, and so forth, all with an interest in cultivated meat. And we decided at that point to form, and they're from all different fields, most of the different colleges and some of the schools on campus who decided to form the UC Davis Cultivated Meat Consortium. So we have that now. And I would say a group of 12 of the faculty members on campus submitted a large grant to the National Science Foundation, a proposal to the National Science Foundation in February. If it's funded, and that's a big if at this point with federal funding, but if it is funded, that would form a nucleus for even more research to go on campus. And the faculty members in that proposal ranged from people with backgrounds like mine in food science and chemical engineering to people in sensory science, food chemistry, nutrition, animal science, agricultural economics, chemical engineering, biomedical engineering, especially on the 3-dimensional structure side of things. People like Pablo Ross, who Alison mentioned, on the cell line development. So it would be a very comprehensive effort if it's funded. My hope is we've been talking quite a bit to companies in the field as well. And they've been talking to researchers on campus. They've been coming in to give seminars on campus. People like organizations like Good Food Institute has come in and talked to people on campus. So I think there's starting to be a nucleus there. It would certainly be helped by the NSF proposal being funded or other companies coming in and funding a consortium that would fund further research in the area. So I think it's a nucleus, but it's a very, very much a nascent area, very new area at universities across the United States and the world at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so now we have a question that's aimed more for Dr. Kebreab. So I know you work more on the sustainability side of of livestock production. But how would you personally weigh the ethical concerns that are involved in this, as well as some of the public health concerns such as antibiotic resistance and zoonotic disease outbreaks that can be associated with animal agriculture?
Right. So I think in terms of animal agriculture, I mean, there are some concerns like you mentioned with antimicrobial resistance in particular being one of the major ones. But these things are being addressed, and in the EU, for example, antibiotic use for subtherapeutic use of antibiotics has been banned for a while in California since January 1st to 2018. The same thing applied as well, and other places are happening the same, are following suit as well. What you don't have is in areas in some low-income countries where the legislations are a bit lax. That's where you have a bit of a problem. I know FAO has been really pushing on that and trying to reduce the AMRs, the antimicrobial resistance in a number of countries. And there are some solutions that are coming up now. There are solutions that would, instead of using antibiotics in a subtherapeutic doses, you could use things like passive immunization. So this is where you get immunized chicken, gets an egg. The eggs will have antibodies, and then you can dry them and orally administer to the swine or other livestock as well. So right now, there's a number of things happening, or you can use bacteriophages where you target certain pathogenic bacteria, where you'll be able to reduce those infections as well. So I think those are the things that will be happening and trying to reduce those infections. In terms of the ethical use of animals, animal welfare has been getting better and better, and actually it makes a good business sense. Animals that are healthy, that are comfortable in their surroundings, would actually grow faster, and they provide better products. So it is a good business sense to keep your animals healthy. So yeah, there has been a lot of concerns on animal welfare, but that thing is moving. Here in UC Davis, we have a number of people that are dedicating their career on working on animal welfare in dairy and poultry and swine, so in different type of livestock. That work is going on, not just at UC Davis, but throughout the world. That question is going on as well. I mean, some people basically they have an issue with consuming animals or using animals as a source of food. You can't really do much about that. But in terms of how animals are treated, then we've come a long way, and I think there's a lot of work that's been happening to try to make sure that the animal welfare considerations are top priority for producers.
Okay. Also, do you personally, or could you possibly see the large-scale alternative protein production working in tandem with a smaller-scale traditional livestock animal agriculture in a sustainable way?
Well, personally, I think I see it the other way around, because if you look at the FAO numbers, the demand for meat is going to grow by 80%. In the next 10 years, you will see about 80% more demand for meat, but 60% for dairy and 500% for eggs. So the animal source protein demand is going to be huge, and particularly in low-income countries. So the beef consumption has been constant in high-income countries, but in low-income countries it's been increasing as people have more disposable income. The first thing they want to do is have more nutritious food and animal source foods. And so I see that alternative protein sources could play a role. I mean, by some estimates, there would be a market share of somewhere like 10% or so. Even if you have doubled that 20% market share in the next 10 years, you still have huge amount of demand that cannot be met by small-scale agriculture. I mean, it's just not going to happen. I mean, there's a huge demand, and so we're going to have to, if anything, there has to be more intensification of animal agriculture, where you can actually be able to make sure the carbon footprint and ecological footprint is lower, and so. I would definitely see that there's going to be a demand for more animal products. Therefore, you have to have more intensive animal livestock production systems happening in low-income countries. So you're going to see more and more of that happening, rather than a slowing down of livestock production and an increase in alternative proteins. So there's no doubt there will be an increase in alternative proteins, but the market reach is going to be very limited. It's not going to reach farmers in Africa and consumers in Africa and a lot of places in Southeast Asia as well. So it's going to be quite limited to high-income countries.
Okay. I mean, I would say hopefully we see some sort of gradual societal change in demand, but that remains to be seen, of course. All right. So I think we'll move on to another question that's aimed more for Dr. Hopwood. So you already talked a little bit about what kind of drives meat consumption or veganism or vegetarianism, but I think it's interesting to note that in the context of cultivated meat specifically, some vegans or vegetarians may reject the idea of taking a biopsy from an animal for the sake of producing cultivated meat. And so as a psychologist, how would you personally predict that companies could maybe promote an ethical standpoint to their cultivated meat products?
People are probably familiar with the fact that there's sort of two camps of people who object to eating animals. There's the sort of utilitarian, effective altruism camp, which tend to be a little more on the practical side. I think they would hear some of the stuff that Dr. Kebreab just described and think we can't afford to be overly principled about this question because the challenge is too enormous from an animal rights perspective to be purist. And I think that crowd will probably be relatively easy to convince regarding that issue, given the sort of the general equation or this sort of overall impact on animal welfare. The good news there is that that group probably also is more compelling to typical citizens who maybe don't have animal rights in the forefront of their mind or ethical concerns. So that group tends to be more influential and in my view tends to be more successful in doing things like Meatless Mondays and stuff like that to try to encourage people to consider reducing their animal consumption. The other camp is the sort of more purely ethical or sometimes militant sort of vegan movement. I think they're going to be quite difficult to convince to find favor in anything that they regard as animal exploitation, because they tend to be pretty absolutist about that sort of thing. So I'm not sure it's going to be a great use of resources to try to convince people who take that perspective. But the good news there is that they tend to be quite small and not particularly well positioned to have a large degree of public influence. They do have certain groups with power. PETA sort of rides the line between those two positions, and PETA certainly has a fair amount of power vis-a-vis the general public. I think the other important thing to remember about this is that most people, in our data at least, are not primarily motivated by animal rights. What we find when we look at correlates of the different motivations is that many people are motivated for the sort of environmental stuff for a variety of different reasons, because they're politically liberal, or they care about nature, or they're just sort of aware of sort of truth about that problem. Almost everybody is concerned about their own personal health. People who are concerned about animal rights tend to have that as a fairly specific and strong motivation, and they sort of set apart from the general population. And I wouldn't predict that the size of that group is going to change very much over time, whereas I do think that the increasing awareness of the environmental impact and health impacts will change people's opinions about those two motivations.
Great, thank you very much. Sophie, would you like to pose the next question?
Yeah, and before I do that, I just wanted to say, I thought it was interesting how, although we had many different backgrounds from the speakers so far, it seems like everyone believes, whether for health or ethical reasons or environmental reasons, that the sustainable agriculture and the alternative proteins, they need to work together in some way. And I think because the speakers are in science, in the science field, and in the like human benefit field, it's important to remember that we're trying to make the world a better place for everyone and not split it apart between the two parts, like Alison had said earlier. So I thought that was just an interesting trend. Whether some of you guys think the alt protein needs to be at a greater ratio than the other is up to debate still, but I think it's very interesting. So the last question is directed towards Marie. I think it's really important that we included this dietitian on this panel. So we've definitely talked about how people have a demand for more nutritious food. And we also have an interest in these alternative protein trends. But some plant-based burgers or something like that may not be, there is a nutritional deficit maybe in some of the products. So could you talk about how we may be able to improve the nutrition of plant-based burgers, or stray away from the fear of like processed foods? So how could we improve the nutrition of these products?
Thank you. I think in doing a comparison of a couple of the products that are on the market right now with the hamburger, we see that the saturated fat intake is very similar. And so that's one thing when we're looking at our, heart health and reducing saturated fat. And it does come from a different source. Like, for example, with the Impossible Burger, they're using coconut oil as the source of the saturated fat. And so some argue that because coconut oil has the medium chain triglycerides, that doesn't have the same impact as, say, a saturated fat that's coming from beef. But when we look at it, there's actually a very small percentage of the MCT that's in the coconut oil. So there's not really much of a health benefit with that. And then the sodium is quite a bit higher as well in the more processed products. So I think that's something to look at. One thing that we encourage is going towards more of a whole food plant-based meal plan. And these to me seem very, very highly processed, for example, the product that's made with the soy, it's still very processed, and it's not including the whole soy product. And so you're not getting all of the health benefits of that. A lot of the isoflavones are missing in that product. So I still tend to encourage, whether you're going to have beef on occasion or have an alternative, looking at something that's less processed rather than trying to make something that looks and tastes like meat.
Great, thank you. I was also going to add, like for the cultured meats, which you would consider to be more processed because there are more steps to prepare these products maybe. What do you think about the like vitamin supplement that's needed, like vitamin B12, that would be needed to fortify the cultured meats. Do you think that would be a benefit to the cultured meats?
Sure, it would provide a nutrient that is hard to obtain otherwise when you have a completely plant-based meal plan.
All right, thank you very much.
This is Alison. Can I
Yes.
just pipe in with that? So the B12 is generated in GM bacteria, right, is the current source of it. And I believe that Impossible uses that and adds that to their product. But Beyond has come out anti-GMO. They've got the non-GMO label. And it's interesting to look at the nutritional comparison because they've chosen not to include any of the vitamins and minerals that are produced using GM microorganisms. And so, you know, that's kind of the consequence of saying no to this technology. You therefore lose the ability to use these supplements. And so it's not a nutritionally equivalent product.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Can I ask a brief follow-up to Alison?
Yes, definitely, please.
Is that the case of all B12 plant-based B12 supplements, or are there vitamins that are not? You make a convincing case regarding not being too strict about this issue, but I just wonder, is that generally the case about plant-based B12, or are there non-GMO versions?
I'd have to talk to someone that's not an animal geneticist, but I believe that that is the case, is that the B12 is derived from, and there's a really subtle difference with the labeling of some of this stuff. So if it's produced in a GMO microorganism, but then it's purified and added, that's a different thing than having GMO corn, for example, where you've still got the DNA there. Not that it really makes any difference from a safety perspective, but ingredient or additives are kind of exempt from that law. And that's why you can have like cheese that's made with GMO rennet and you don't have to label it with you don't have to label it GE. So I'd look to maybe David, I don't know, but my understanding is that that is a cultured product from a microbe that's produced in that manner.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I think you're right. In cheese, a large part of the enzymes that are used in commercial cheese making are made through genetic engineering and probably purified. So maybe it doesn't have to say that. But I'm not sure of the details.
What was interesting was, I don't know if you remember Cheerios, you know, gold box Cheerios. They put a butterfly on there, and if you compared the nutritional composition of the cereal before and after, it lost all its vitamins because they could no longer use that. Because if you want the non-GMO label, then you're not allowed to use these products. So it has these really real implications in terms of food quality for just a perceived, you know, safety thing that's never had any data. It's kind of intriguing. It's probably something that the psychologists can look into and understand that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking it does create a really interesting ethical kind of question, and it sounds like an ill-informed in many cases for people who are really against GMOs and also really against eating animal products. One presumes that they still want themselves and their family members to be healthy. And so at some point you sort of have to deal with reality.
It's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I believe that like B12 that's found in animal products is actually produced by bacteria that are found on the animal products. So I think that's interesting that it's still just a microbial product anyway.
That's my understanding, is it's the bacteria in the animal that makes the B12.
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting. In Ted's project, we've been talking about cultivated meat and what to put in the media, and it's interesting because in some products that are produced that go into, let's say, animal feed, or at least used to be produced. They were only partially purified. And so let's say we talked about earlier about antibiotics that might go into a feed. They were only partially purified because it was cheaper to do that. And pretty much all the ingredients in the media for making that antibiotic were food grade agricultural products. And so there is some thought that if you could actually have a media with that you're using to grow cultivated meat, that you could be leaving some of those media ingredients in, and you could use that to be a supplement nutritionally as well. So you could choose media ingredients where there would be leftover vitamins, for instance, at the end of the processing, and that would end up in the product, not only giving extra nutrients, but also flavor as well.
Okay. So I think at this point, we'll start taking questions from the audience, but I'm not sure, does Mariah want to say a few closing remarks?
Yes, I would like to thank our panelists and, of course, everyone in attendance. You can connect with us via our Facebook page, Davis Alt Protein Project, and we'd like to hear from you of what kinds of discussions and panels that you'd like to see in the future. Please direct your first questions towards Chris Hopwood, because he needs to leave at 5, and then we can continue any sorts of questions that you have until 5:30.
In the meantime, while people are thinking of questions, we do have some more general questions that we can ask. So we're interested in hearing your opinions on what are the barriers to beginning new academic research in this field of alternative protein? Could it be like government or funding or just interest in general? Anyone can feel free to chime in.
This is a new field for me, but it's also a new sub area for my field. And it's one thing trying to become familiar with the literature in my area and in neighboring areas, let alone the kind of stuff that some of my colleagues have been talking about in this call that's relevant. But I have a hard time just getting started in certain ways, like finding students who would be interested in this, because I don't think people who are interested in this topic necessarily think of personality psychology as a place to go study it. Knowing the right journals to disseminate stuff in. There are a couple of journals about food science, like Appetite, for example. Maybe you're familiar with this journal. It's not quite right for the stuff that I do. So the sort of journals I typically publish in aren't quite right. So it's hard to know exactly where to send stuff. It's also hard to know how to pitch grants. Are we asking questions about how people think about their world and their diet? Are we asking questions about advocacy? So I've just had a hard time figuring out how to get people to work with me on this and how to sort of pitch it for the right kinds of audiences. But I think largely that's because it's a new field and I'm just sort of getting started in it.
Yeah, and that's why I think having some kind of consortium that's visible to other people, like students and other faculty, would be great for you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, and I will say that part of if we were to be successful in getting the grant from NSF, or I think at this point, even if we're not, the Davis Alt Protein Project group, this group that's putting on this program today, is thinking about doing, I think, monthly programs in the next academic year, bringing in speakers, many of them potentially internal to UC Davis, and also some more panels. And I think that would be a great way of keeping the discussion going.
I could just take a try to answer Yelin's question about the Asian market, only with an observation from our data that we've collected we've collected national data, and we've collected the data from students at UC Davis, and there is a pretty strong demographic pattern where Asian respondents tend to be much more likely to endorse meat eating and much less likely to endorse ethical concerns regarding meat eating. So again, that's Asian Americans. It's also Asian international students. So there seems to be something. I don't have any thoughts or speculations about what that might be. I'm sure other people on this call do, but it's certainly a pattern that we've been picking up in our data.
I don't know, maybe Ted can talk a little bit more about this, but you know, there are multiple companies in Asia thinking about cultivated meat, or in the cultivated meat space. I remember one of them was working on seafood, I think. I don't know, Ted, if you remember more details than I do, but so it's not as large a number of companies as, for instance, in Northern California, but there are some there as well.
Definitely a bigger focus on seafood in terms of alt protein there. Yeah, again, like I don't know too many of the details about that, but I think there are a lot of people from GFI on this. Maybe if someone wants to respond to that, but yeah, I would just say that seafood seems to be a pretty big focus.
I think I'm not exactly sure what Asia encompasses, so there's a lot of different countries there. So I think that if we're looking at China, that they are a very big meat-eating country, and their consumption of pork just is like blows your mind. And they're in the middle of this pandemic that doesn't get much advertisement, and that's the African swine fever pandemic, which has basically eliminated about half their pigs, and that has got to put some pressure on them in terms of getting protein to their 1.3 billion people. And then I think if you look at India, you know, that's such an interesting country. There's a lot of vegetarianism there and huge amounts of nutritional stunting from lack of access to animal source foods, and then also the biggest cattle population in the world, but they can't eat them. And so there's a lot of different reasons why different people eat meat or don't eat meat, or why people have animals or don't have animals. That's much more than the first world discussion that tends to be, you know, what about things that have really nothing to do with nutritional security. It's more personal choice, and there's lots of options, and it's not really about is my child going to be mentally retarded because I can't get access to food. And I think those two groups, it's a really different topic, really, and it's sometimes it kind of gets conflated. And I think when we're talking in the first world, it's a really different discussion and what the options might be than in some of the developing worlds. And I guess that kind of gets to the next question there. And I don't know, probably Ermias has something that he might want to say there. If you look at from niche shifts towards alternative proteins, I think in some countries they're happy with any calories they can get. And, you know, I think that's something that this audience perhaps is not too familiar with. Perhaps Ermias can say that's not his situation when he was growing up, but first world Australian doesn't have any idea what that looks like.
Well, I think not just growing up, but I also work quite a bit in low-income countries, and I think one thing that we need to remember is that livestock production is a livelihood for hundreds of millions of people. And so I think that part should not be neglected, and I think that, you know, alternative protein sources definitely will have a place and help in filling the gap as well. But I don't think we're there, particularly in developing countries, to be able to massively increase the alternative protein sources as substitute for livestock production. And what we can do, and I think right now is both of them. It's not just one or the other, but I think in terms of livestock production, we're trying to achieve, be more a better sustainability of that production, reducing carbon footprint, and it's possible. We've already done it in a lot of places in high-income countries, and there's no reason why we cannot do that in low-income countries as well. And things are improving, but still there is a huge gap. And when there's not, excuse me, there's not enough availability of protein sources right now, and that's why you see a lot of cases of stunting. And in places in Ethiopia where I work, up to 60% of children have some sort of stunting because they don't have enough animal source food and micro minerals. So if that can be addressed through alternative protein sources, then that'll be great. But I think at the moment, I find it very difficult for those kind of countries to jump into that, while we're still trying to figure out how to do it properly here in high-income countries.
And I think whatever solution, and Ermias, you probably have a better feel for this working in some of these countries than I do, but whatever the solution is, has to be acknowledge the culture of the people that are there. Yeah. I mean, someone, and this is not a good example maybe of that real problem, but some people in food science came up to me at some point and said, we want to do a program where you eat a bunch of insects and tell us what wine goes best with them, right? Well, insects are not something that culturally Americans have eaten. It's not that we couldn't eat them or that it's not a good protein source, but it's going to be a much harder sell than bringing in solutions for alternative proteins that match with the culture of the people who need to consume them.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of cultural considerations that need to be taken into account as well. I mean, like you said, and a lot of times people have livestock as sort of a risk management, or like as a bank. I remember when I graduated from college, we sold one goat so that I can buy a suit for graduation ceremony. So it's not just about the food that they provide, but there's other cultural things that and risk management that people use them for as well.
If you get a cashmere suit, Ermias, that would be ironic.
I can't remember what it was now.
So I have a question related to that, I guess, for Ermias and Alison. One of the thoughts is, if, let's say, cultivated meat, people get over the technological hurdles, and it's a question of where should that be located? Should it be located near an urban environment because that's where the people are who need the meat? But then the raw materials are likely to be have to come from the Midwest or somewhere from a distance. Do you put the production where the agricultural products are that you grow the meat cells on, and then have to transport the meat? Maybe that's more expensive because it has to be done in refrigerated containers. And do you think that it's possible that people who are doing traditional agriculture now, raising livestock in this country, might decide that they can do both in the same location? So instead of, say, putting their agricultural feeds towards feeding livestock or whatever, might they form cooperatives where they at the same time could hedge their bets and create cultivated meat?
I can go first if you want, Alison. So I think for me it's definitely possible, and you can definitely do that. I mean, if you look at Tyson Foods, they've gone into plant-based meat as well as, so they have a blend of plant and also beef and plant together as well. So I guess their business model probably is something like what you're describing, where you have both sort of going on together. But one way or another, I think the food would have to be moving from one place to another as well. So I think there's one comment I'm just seeing now. It says cows in your field and bioreactor in your barn. Where I've heard Alison before say that cows are bioreactor themselves. They turn energy from plants into high quality protein for us. So they are self-replicating bioreactors. That's the way it is. So there's always cost to making protein. So even if it is plant-based or cellular meat production, there's going to be the production of the raw materials. Some of the raw materials may be similar. They have soy, for example. Impossible Foods they use soy, right? So and animal agriculture also uses soy. So are you replacing soy from animal agriculture putting into a plant? And at least in animal agriculture, you use more of the soy, while in Impossible Burger, you take the protein out. What are you going to do with the rest? And one of the advantages of having livestock is they are recyclers, or some people will call upcyclers of waste material. In California, we estimate about 50% of the feed that animals are consuming is actually a byproduct. It's like almond hulls. You go to any dairy in California, you would see mountains of almond hulls. It used to be thrown into for waste, basically, which will generate methane, have more impact on the environment. But now it's been used there, like tomato pomace, and there are dried distillers grains, and hopefully some grape pomace as well. All of these byproducts that are produced locally are used by livestock, so that you don't have waste. You're actually using that. So if you actually do it, if you calculate what is the human edible part going into animals and what you get out of animals, it's actually more efficient, because the protein, the stuff that we cannot eat, you cannot really count as something that's going into that. If you count everything, then yes, you could say it's not efficient. But if you just look at how much of human edible protein is going into livestock and how much you get out of it, usually it's over one, which is you actually add value to it than taking resources.
I wonder if there's a way to maybe process some of that agricultural byproduct in such a way as to be able to use it in alternative protein products. I feel like that might be a future research.
There's one comment that I'd like to address very quickly in terms of we could use this land to grow fodder and all that. But most beef in the United States are actually grown in marginal lands. So it's called marginal because you cannot really grow anything except this grass. So you cannot turn it into forest or grow vegetables or other things. They are, you can only have a perennial grass there that animals would graze and actually help sequester more carbon. So the majority of lands that animals use, particularly beef cattle use, is really marginal. You can't really grow other crops and use it for something else, or for forests or anything else.
I'd just like to comment on your question, David, specifically, and I'm going to focus specifically on in vitro meat. I think sometimes we kind of jump between like vegan burgers and in vitro meat. In vitro meat is going to have to happen where there is a non-carbon source of electricity. Else it's going to be worse than cows in terms of its carbon footprint. So somewhere where there's maybe 100% solar or nuclear or something like that. And it's also going to have to be somewhere where there's a really good source of water for the culture media and all the washing and all the rest that's going to need to go on. And so, and depending what happens with the spent media, that may or may not make it compatible with being in a city. So I think there's some design considerations there that'll influence that. Ideally, you do it in the garage of, I don't know, one trade center in New York, right? So that you've got your food right there where the people are. But it's going to have decarbonized source of industrial energy to run the whole thing, I think, for it to make any kind of sense from an environmental perspective.
But just out of curiosity, so because I think at this point I can't even see there being enough information to do a complete life cycle analysis on the processing for what you're calling in vitro meat. So what do you see as the biggest uses of energy in that process?
Well, I would, keeping the vats at 37 is going to have to be driven by energy. And then basically performing all of the things that a biological system does is going to be replaced with industrial energy. So, you know, there's no immune system, so you're going to have to keep everything sterile. There's no body thermoregulation, so you're going to have to keep everything at temperature. And my understanding is that the quality of the media is going to have to be food grade. And so producing all of that to feed to the cells, and then of course cleaning the vats, depending which system it is, and that's yet to be decided. And I realize these are anticipatory at this stage because no one's actually doing it, but I look at Chinese hamster ovary cells, which may or may not be a good proxy, and the water usage for producing, you know, biopharmaceuticals and that type of thing, and cleaning those vats, and the energy requirements are substantial. So that, to me, I think is where it's going to be difficult to make that work, especially if you're using, you know, a coal-fired electricity source. I'm not sure you're helping anything.
Well, I think, you know, I think a lot of those things are still kind of up in the air right now, but I will point out that, you know, whether it's a good idea or not, if you look at medicinal feed additives, so antibiotics that you feed to chickens or cows or whatever, those have been produced for, I don't know, 30, 40 years at the 40,000 gallon scale in or close to metropolitan areas, and being sold for the same price per pound as a hamburger. And so it must be possible from that point of view. When I say must be possible, given what we know now, it seems like it would be. And the ingredients, the media ingredients in that case, are pretty much all food grade agricultural products anyway. So I would say that's probably more of a similar kind of comparison than the, let's say, Genentech down the street in Vacaville producing CHO cells or myeloma cells at a 25,000 liter scale. And I think, you know, the water comparison would have to be done. You know, a lot of the water, there's going to be water in the media. I don't know how that compares to water you would give animals. The quality is definitely different, like you're talking about. But a lot of it would be in the cleaning. So I think you'd have to include the cleaning of the meat processing equipment and current processing facilities with the cleaning standards you need in a fermentation facility. And again, I don't have the answer to which one's better, but it may not be as far off as what you're thinking.
Well, and we're not growing cows in the city, so I think, you know, there's a reason that they're being grown where they are, as Ermias alluded to. So if you are going to have them, or these vats in the city, then you know, what water use and all of that is going to be relevant, depending upon what water availability there is in that city. It's no different to cows, really. It's just, I totally agree that good life cycle analyses are going to be the evidence upon which we should base our determination.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
nothing actually being produced. It's just hand waving.
Yep.
And I think it needs to be a consequential LCA as well, not just attributional, where you just see, you know, what's at the inputs and the outputs, and that's it. That you have to look at what happens if you're doing this kind of things, right? So if you eliminate livestock, then what's going to happen to a lot of the waste product that we have that now animals are consuming? you're going to have to think about, you have to increase production of some plants, but particularly soy. And so, you're going to need more land to be able to do that. So where are you going to do that? So I think it's not just about looking at, this is the input and that's the output. I think you have to look at what's the consequences of doing that as well.
Yeah, and I do think it's complex, and I don't think we have enough information, but, common ingredients in large scale, low value product fermentation are things like yeast extract and soy flour, corn steep solids, corn steep liquor, molasses, things like that, cornstarch. And so you could imagine, you go to Anheuser-Busch here and they always talk about how all their lees, all their old yeast go into cattle feed. It could actually go as a yeast extract into a media, similar to some of the other things like, soy byproducts and so forth. Again, it's not a one-to-one comparison. And so without having all that extra information about what's going to work and what's not going to work, I don't even think there's enough information right now to have a side-by-side life cycle comparison.
I have a question that is on another topic, on the topic of food safety. So I am interested in food safety, and I think the foodborne pathogen outbreaks associated with meat and also the runoff from farms into vegetable products, I think that's something we're all aware of. So if we were to continue with a mass livestock production, if we were to continue with that being our main source of protein, how can sustainable agriculture do better at the good agricultural practices and the good manufacturing practices to prevent foodborne pathogen contamination? Because right now I would think that the cultured meat side would have a lesser risk of this contamination. And if there is contamination, it would be from humans themselves, the workers. So how can we improve the food safety side from meat production if we're sticking with meat production?
Well, if we're talking about using manure as fertilizer, there are some safety requirements that need to be done in terms of composting to basically kill pathogens. And when that doesn't happen is when you have a problem. But I think it is important to remember, I think it's about half of global nitrogen is cow shit or animal feces. And so that is a really important service that is provided by animals. And there is a requirement to compost it so that it goes through a heat cycle that basically eliminates those pathogens. And when you have that not happening is when you run into trouble.
And also there's more and more use of anaerobic digesters these days, and I think anaerobic digesters would effectively sterilize the manure as well. So what comes out of it is more or less sterile. But yeah, composting and anaerobic digestion would help reduce the pathogen load in manure.
But there's no doubt that if you've got a sterile vat of cells, there shouldn't be any bacterial contamination by definition, right? And so, the challenge is keeping it sterile, but it should not have any pathogens.
Definitely. And I think if you end up seeing pathogens in that meat, you would have a problem with your worker hygiene. So you have one person to turn to in that situation, whereas I think the E. coli outbreaks in lettuce, but also in meat itself, or even salmonella outbreaks, there are so many problems that could stem from, or so many causes that could have stemmed from. So from a food safety perspective, it's I guess complex on both sides in very different ways. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Derek Reisner, and I'm currently working on a techno-economic analysis for cell-based meat. And what we're finding is cell metabolism is probably one of the most important aspects for lowering the cost. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are for using genetic engineering for decreasing maybe glucose consumption rates or growth factor reduction.
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, but you know, I think from a technical point of view, it seems like that could have some advantage. I'm not sure. You may know more about where the, I guess you're saying that's where a lot of the costs are. To me, it gets back to that same kind of issue with like Impossible Burger, where it depends on how much overlap there is between people in that case who are vegetarian and are okay with a GMO, right?
Right.
And if there isn't a lot of overlap there, if vegetarians are okay eating GMOs, then something like this wouldn't be an issue. If the main reason you're producing cultivated meat is because there's not enough meat coming from traditional agriculture and you want to complement that, and there's, you know, you can show that there's no safety issues and so forth, like Alison talked about, then, you know, it shouldn't be an issue. It would be a shame to produce a product that nobody's going to eat, though, right? That would be a waste of time.
Yeah, and money.
Yeah.
This is Alison. Sorry, I got kicked out of the meeting. But I think the question was, what about using genetic engineering to improve cell metabolism? And I think the growth rate of mammalian cells is going to be an issue. And you're asking me if we should use genetic engineering. I think you probably know what my answer is. Of course we should. Oh, why not? Right? It doesn't make any sense not to. So, but that was, I probably didn't even need to add that.
Do you foresee any like regulations related to like the FDA, like additional regulations if you're using genetic engineering for these products?
I probably shouldn't comment because I don't have a very good relationship with the FDA, but they have effectively killed the use of this technology in anything to do with animal agriculture. And I don't really see that this is going to be that different. So if they're going to regulate these cells as drugs, which is what basically my cows without horns are, then it elevates the cost of everything beyond belief. And you also potentially bring in the very well-funded natural foods people who will go after you with their science out, and that's, you know, it's something that is real in terms of their I look at Impossible Burger, and you know, it's like if everyone hates GMOs, then that burger seems to be doing pretty well. So I think a lot of this is just a good product on the market. Overcomes a lot of this back and forth and hypotheticals, but it's a very high risk gamble. And if FDA does the same regulatory for this as they do for genetically engineered and edited animals, that will be a huge problem.
So, thanks. I was having some technical issues over here, but I think I got the gist of it.
All right. So if there are no more questions, I think we will wrap up. So I want to thank all the panelists that are still here. Thank you so much for joining and engaging in a lively discussion. It's very interesting to hear all your viewpoints. And thank you to everyone else who is attending. Hope you all learned some things from this, and hope you're now a little more interested in this field. So we will try to post the recording of this Zoom meeting on our Google Drive. We'll put a link in there and send it out. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any other questions about anything that was discussed in this meeting. So with that, thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.